Well, this morning for me, and it's already actually midday for where our guest is at, it's a pleasure to welcome a speaker who has a lot of experience in helping churches communicate and collaborate with networks and with agencies. Our speaker lives in that intersection between these different entities, and she has over 20 years of experience in consulting with these groups and helping practical partnerships move forward. She's president of Catalyst Services, and she's coming to us today from the Philadelphia area here in the United States. And so would you welcome with me Ellen Livingood?
Thanks so much. And it's a privilege to be able to be sharing with you today. And I hope that this is a practical kind of discussion, and that you are in one or possibly two aspects of this discussion. You may represent a church, you may represent a network, or actually both. I do want to just say that for me, this is definitely, sorry, trigger finger is a little too fast. I'm a fellow learner in all of this. I think all of us are really feel like we're getting some experience in all of this, but an opportunity to really say, hey, what's God doing, and how can we better utilize the resources that we have of church and agency. Okay, I'm in that process. Okay, there we go. Reading messages at the same time. So we just want to emphasize that I believe in the local church, and I think you do too. God doesn't have a plan B. He's using the church. We believe in networks because networks are a practical, flexible way of working together in the global setting. And I think those two entities need each other in that process. We don't have the answers. We're figuring out how that happens. So what are networks? Everybody has maybe a different definition of what a network is. But I would just say a network is a place or a space where organizations and various kinds of entities, again, churches, individuals, can come together and say, what are our shared passions and what are our shared goals? And that leads, I think, first to relationship and then oftentimes to working together. Now, just for a little bit of background, how did we get where we are? We've had some transitions, I believe, but from the side, the perspective of history, we, I think, started out with really three different types of networks. The first was field networks, and that was largely first missionaries that got together, now many more nationals and other entities on the field, and said, what can we do? How can we work together? Then sort of developed what has been called resourcing networks. I don't necessarily like that term because it tends to imply all one-way delivery, but many of these are developed in the West and often built around either a country or unreached people group, where oftentimes churches were saying, how can we resource, how can we come together to support the effort to reach this group? Then there's churches that are networks. Sometimes denominations function like a network or have a network aspect to them. And newer regional networks sometimes are really designed as church-based. So there's various kinds of networks, and nowadays some of them are merging, and we're having several of these, but sort of I think it's helpful to think about the different types. So we just want to come into a poll and just ask you this now, what is it that, okay, there we go. We need to move into our next, there we go. What is your experience with networks? Are you primarily involved with a field network, primarily with a network, a resourcing network, a network of churches, another type of network we haven't talked about, or you may say, I don't yet have any experience with a network. So just pick one of those, the one that is most represents you at this particular point of time, and give us an idea of who's on the call today and what specific interests you have. As we do that, just say that I started out really involved with the resourcing network aspect, and I can clearly remember the first couple of network meetings that I went to, and I was so encouraged. I met people from a broad perspective, but all sharing a focus, in this case, usually either a UPG or sometimes a country, but also sometimes I was really confused. What was that about, and how, did I fit there? I may have probably came with a church hat, and I was saying, is this for me? How does this work? Then recently been involved in launching 2 different kinds of networks. One is the Philadelphia Regional Diaspora Network, which is bringing together entities in this region to try to, again, collaborate, also inform and encourage one another. And then a kinship network that is involved in bringing churches here in the West together with churches in the Middle East, particularly around Syrian refugee issues. So those are kind of some of the experiences that I'm coming from and learning together with you. So it looks like we have just about almost an even number on each of those different categories. So that's helpful to know that we're representing different kinds of experiences in the area of networks and churches. Churches add needed gifts and diversity to networks. You might say, well, that's pretty obvious. But I think that we need to be reminded of that, particularly if they aren't yet at the table, or you are coming from the church perspective and you're saying, we're interested. They are, if you look at we think of pens and markers and pencils and all those kinds of things. The diversity that churches bring is very broad in that network world. At the same time, churches themselves are very diverse. And I think that sometimes for us, and we've had this tendency in our network settings to kind of lump churches together and say, well, if churches participate, here's what they will bring, or here's what they will need. And the reality is that churches are really different. And that makes it more challenging, perhaps, to engage them well. Or if you're coming from the church side, it challenges you to say, how can I help my network understand the uniqueness of my church and what that brings to the process? But it's part of that, the gift of networks, of churches in networks, that they do bring that kind of diversity. Churches are then themselves changing rapidly, and of course we could talk about this as a whole session, and that we all are experiencing the changes, but for instance, the generational changes are changing how people interact. I think networks are perhaps even more attractive and function well for younger generations because they're used to working virtually, and they love to work in diverse kinds of settings. At the same time as we have a lot of transition in leadership, sometimes we have a transition and we think that, we have a church engaged and they're going to continue in that same type of engagement. And yet we find many times that about the time we think we're on the same page and moving forward, we discover that the church has changed. And so that's a challenge. It used to be that churches were probably the most stable kind of partner, but that's no longer the case. So another challenge there is that change of churches. Then churches need preparation to function well in networks. And maybe all of these statements seem like a no-brainer, but churches need pathways. There's all kinds of opportunities, but it's a daunting world for churches to come into a network setting and know how do they contribute, and what is it they can take from it? We need that two-way street, but it really needs preparation. And that really demands time. It demands time on the church's part to say, how are we going to do that well? And it takes time on the network to say, how do we get them up to speed to function well and comfortably in this setting? So it's an opportunity to think through, how are we going to make that happen? The flip side of that, and I know I don't need to tell most of you this, but networks often function on a relatively small margin of leadership resources. Now, if you're on the network side, you know that, but sometimes the churches may not realize how stretched network leadership often is in missions. Many times there's just, you come to a meeting and there may be a perception from churches that the network leaders do that all the time and this is their full-time job. Yet for most of you, you probably have one or maybe a couple of other full-time jobs, and leading the network or investing in the network is something that is yet another hat that you're wearing. So how we integrate all of this and what that looks like is a challenge because of that lack of time. We have to appreciate the fact that we do this many times as a labor of love that's an add-on. So what is the potential of network church collaboration? Let me just share a few examples in different areas of what churches are contributing and benefiting in this. The first thing I would say, and you'll hear me come back to this a couple times today, is that I think one of the great, great values of churches and networks is the opportunity to pour fuel on the prayer ministry of the church. I'm very concerned that we may give some lip service to prayer for missions and for mobilization, for reaching important global goals, but how have we really engaged people in that? The communications of those things, the challenge of that is different and more difficult today. And I think there's a great opportunity. I know one group that's working, one network that's focused in a very, very unreached but very high security area of the world. And one of the major things that their network does is communicate prayer needs and to keep that in front of people. It's easier for them to do it because there's a bit of distance because it's happening through a network, but it also gives them an opportunity to combine forces and help churches to pray more passionately because they're seeing a big picture. There's an opportunity with networks to help guide the financial investment of churches. I know one of the networks that really worked hard at saying we're not going to, obviously we don't control where churches give, but we have seen churches sometimes invest poorly, and we would like to help raise the bar, help them to understand what are priorities, clarify among ourselves what are the priorities, and do that well. Making easy on-ramps. There's another agency that is really, focused on creating easy on-ramps for smaller churches, for churches that don't necessarily have a missions pastor that's real conversant in all of these kinds of things and knows all the ins and outs. And so they really have created easy ways for churches to say, hey, we will walk alongside of you and help you get involved. I think that's really important and has been very, very successful for them. Organizational leadership. It's exciting. Just talking about the fact that networks are limited on leadership time is to think that there are opportunities to draw from churches, people with significant leadership experience. That may be leadership experience in the church. It may be in a secular job. And people, many times, particularly when they're coming to that 50s, 60s age bracket, they have more discretionary time to be able to draw on those gifts and say, we need that for organizational leadership is a tremendous gift that the church can bring. Recruitment. Churches can be great places to recruit the people that you are looking for, specifically for people who are in the area of a particular niche that you need to accomplish a project, to accomplish a goal, that's an opportunity to say through the network we can begin to meet that as churches find out about the needs. Practical training on multiple levels. I know one network that does a great job. They actually clearly identify, here's level 101. If this is your first time coming to our meeting, then your church should walk through this several sessions in our network meeting that help you at 101. Here's the way to begin. They also have a 201 series then, and that helps churches that want to move deeper into that process. There's churches that there's networks that are creating a mentoring system for new churches to be assisted in getting involved by churches that have been there for a while. And that's another great way to use churches to help other churches in that process. So those are some of the exciting things that are happening. Let me just talk then a little bit about what are some of the barriers. I want to start from the network perspective. What are some of the things that make it really difficult to accomplish the goal of integrating churches into networks? Why have they failed in the past? First of all, just by how they've been formed, many of the field networks were missionary driven, and missionaries have a tendency to be really self-reliant. And that's been a great thing, but when you're self-reliant, sometimes you forget that there are resources out there that you can draw on, particularly new kinds of resources that may not be physically present and obvious. Fortunately, we're moving into an day when we're really much more collaborative, and we're thinking about what does it mean to be collaborative. We're collaborative on multiple levels, so there's an opportunity to maximize that in a new way. What about the whole perspective of what does a church bring? Unfortunately, we have so many times seen the church as a nice fat wallet, maybe particularly Western churches, but churches can bring so much more. And I hope that we downplay the financial as we look at what churches bring. Partially because there's so many more ways to communicate, travel is easier now, it's easier to invest in other ways. But let's look beyond the financial. That's important, that's a significant piece, but churches have much more that they bring to the table. We have, many years ago, we were working with a small, younger global church, and perhaps it wasn't ready to contribute at the level that was practical in a network. But one of the exciting things is, and some of you on this call today, I know, are representing a global church that has moved and grown and matured and developed to the point where you are not only able to participate, you're able to drive some of these partnerships, and you have a tremendous amount to offer in that direction, and that's really exciting. And the last one is just that distance and communication barriers made collaboration with churches really difficult in the past, and that's just no longer a major issue. We have lots of ways that churches can get involved. We can move ourselves past those kinds of barriers. So what about from the church perspective? What are the barriers that you're struggling with on that side? First of all, churches don't even know, most of the churches I talk to don't even know that there is a network out there, or probably multiple networks out there, that intersect with some of the passions that they have, with some of the places where they have workers, in that there are ways in which a network could really help them be a better sending church or a better globally engaged church. The Eldon Porters, Linking Global Voices, is certainly an excellent place that we can send them, but I would just challenge you, whatever your role, to say, whatever churches I'm connected to, I want to let them know that there are networks out there that are needing them, and have lots to offer them. Many times churches consider missions exclusively the task of a missionary. And I am glad that we're getting beyond that, because there's so many ways in which churches can be involved. And the missional church now is really aware and saying, how can we get involved? And that's really an exciting transition that we've moved into. This is something that I think is really important, at this point of churches have perceived missionaries as isolated islands and missions work as isolated tasks. And unfortunately, I think this is often because we have, maybe because we want to raise funds. And so we tend to say, oh, I'm going to plant the first church in this city, or I'm the only worker here, or I'm the first the person doing this particular role. And what I'm doing, I'm planning a church, and that really kind of, at least in what I communicate to my churches or my donors, doesn't relate to the fact that we need the Jesus film and we need translation and maybe we need some theological education in our camp. Churches have kind of, because they have focused around individual workers, they tend to think of very siloed ministries. And that's detrimental for all of us. It's very helpful if a network can help churches see that bigger picture. And many times maybe missionaries are a little concerned. I think this is perhaps one reason why we haven't introduced churches that we know into networks, because maybe we're afraid, well, if they get in the network, maybe they won't support me as much. Maybe they'll give to this project, or maybe they'll, see a bigger picture. And I hope we can move beyond that. I hope we have a kingdom mentality that says that, that's not the only thing that what I'm doing. I'm in a kingdom mode, and my church is going to be more involved with me, not less involved, if they see that big picture. So all in all, I think the biggest barrier that we find, whichever side we're looking at, is that we just haven't grasped the importance of engaging the untapped potential of the local church. And I think this is true from the church's side. So many times as we talk to churches and say, what is your untapped potential? And we dig into that, there is a huge amount of potential that's in there. People are looking for significance. And as they see global opportunities and believe and are introduced to the opportunity to get involved in a significant way, there are people who will do that, who you may say, we struggle with, they're apathetic, they're not interested. Sometimes they're apathetic or not interested just because we haven't challenged them something big enough. And a network is a great place to challenge them. So from the church side or from the network side, I think one of our challenges, our biggest barrier has been just not enough vision to see what's there and what the potential is. Okay, we've come to our second poll. And I'd just like to ask you, as we begin to think about, okay, how can we mobilize? What's this going to look like? What kind of things, if you're coming from the church side, think through, just quickly, what could your church offer? What are some of the people, kinds of expertise that your church could offer? And go down through this list. If you're on the network side, think about it from your network side. What could you use? What would that look like? What would be the kinds of things, kinds of people, kinds of gifting and skills and expertise that you say, wow, my network would love to be able to tap into this from a church? So it looks like expertise in business project development or research or testing is about neck and neck with intercessory support at just about 3/4. And then pastoral guidance, administrative leadership, also well above half. And probably down at the bottom, fundraising expertise. Interesting. I don't know whether that's from which side, but sometimes that's a real gift as well. Okay, thank you. So what about the benefits for the network? What is it that they bring? Well, what I've already talked about is that prayer aspect. This is one of the things, for instance, that we're finding very practical in our kinship network piece. We are focusing on communicating big picture prayer requests. Again, when your church is focused only on one small part of the ministry, sometimes it's hard to paint a big picture of what's going on, or sometimes maybe we just don't do it. Whereas a network can paint a big picture. And we can also have an opportunity, and I think this is so important, to regularly, consistently, frequently share with network participants, what is God doing? How is God answering? So many people, I think if we're going to mentor people into prayer, we need to consistently not only give them specific prayer requests, but specific ways that God has answered. I think that nourishes all of us in prayer, but particularly for new people as we're developing intercessors in the church. So this aspect of, again, the benefit is going to cut both ways on this. As churches hear more that they can pray for and more specifics and more answers, what results is the prayer. Because for most of you who are leading networks, you are leading big God-sized projects. You are looking to see amazing things happen. And we all say we believe, and I think we do, but how much focus do we put on that prayer? How much do we say, this is going to happen, not just because of the energy we put in it, not just because we're collaborating, but because we're getting God's people to pray, and God is moving because of that. I just think that's a really exciting aspect of networks. That administrative leadership piece, again, I just hear networks often saying we need more people to do things. And those kinds of people are many times the people who are sitting untapped in local churches. They don't know where that fits, but there's great resources there. And some of them are young, some of them are early retirees, some of them are even, I know one of the really strong people in this area is in his 70s. He's in a church, but he is investing a lot of time and a lot of lifelong expertise in this area of contributing administrative leadership in a network. Logistical support. You're running conferences, if you're maintaining lists, all those kinds of things, again, take a lot of time. Those kinds of people are often available in churches and can be tapped. It's a great way also to get them involved in the passion, build their passion for the network as you tap into their gifting. Project collaboration. Again, churches can come together. A project that's way too big for one church to do can be very doable if multiple churches own it together. And that's encouraging for them because they're part of something bigger. It's encouraging for you because you see a way of getting something done that demands a pool of churches or funders behind it. Advocacy to other churches. Again, the best way I have found in getting churches involved in things is have one church say to another church, hey, this is really great. We just have loved it. This has really benefited us. And so they can be your recruiters. And funding of network projects and leaders. Again, as we move into this world of networks, just talking to someone the other day, and we were talking about how time intensive networks are and quality leaders. We need people who can function at a very significant level, who have experience and language and those kinds of things. The workers, whether they're nationals or expats or whomever, who are doing this and are putting time into it, deserve and need funding to make that happen. And I think churches will be more willing to do that as they see firsthand what it accomplishes as they're a part of that. Okay, what about the benefits for participating in churches? Again, expanded vision through exposure. I just love to see churches come to these network meetings and meet some of the really strategic national leaders who are now driving these kinds of things. That is so valuable for them. National leaders can't come and visit all these churches. It would be way too expensive and way too time consuming. There's maybe other important things they can do. But if leaders of those churches can come to your network meetings and interface with some of these really key strategic leaders, catch their vision and appreciate what God is doing in this new way, it's just a wonderful benefit for churches to be able to have that opportunity. Intensified intercession, again, I've said this before, and I just put it here again because I just think it's so valuable for churches to have a place in which their people are learning what it means to intercede for a lost world, for global advance. Collaboration on big projects, we talked about this again, but again, these projects are not just funding projects, but how can we bring churches together to work in a way that's really collaborative? It's been fun to see in our kinship thing how churches are recruiting other churches to come in and say, hey, will you come with us and do this? We can't do it by ourselves, but let's do it together. That's just a fun thing for them, an encouraging thing for them. Coaching to avoid mistakes. This has been something that I have seen happen, whether it's in an area where ministry's changing and churches need to shift. Just was on a very strategic call not long ago where there was a partner in a network that is learning a whole new way of doing something. And they're saying, oh, we used to do this. Wow, we need to change our strategy. And thank you as a network for helping us to understand that we need to make that kind of transition. That's a wonderful benefit for churches. Reinforcement to stay the course. When you're working in a tough place, in maybe an unreached group that's resistant, it's easy for churches maybe to get started and get excited at the beginning, but to have churches engage across the long haul, to have that encouragement and stabilizing force of the network is just wonderful. And then learning from other churches. Again, I just find it interesting to see that many times at network meetings, churches gravitate together and they're sitting over a meal saying, hey, how are you doing this? How are you doing this? What's your experience like? How are you preparing short-term teams to go to this area of the world or whatever it is? It's just an opportunity for them to be really encouraging to one another. Okay, some first steps, and I'm just going to mention these. I think we've kind of gotten some of the background, but highlight church involvement models. In other words, do you have churches that are really doing a good job, and can you tell their story? So telling their story or having them tell their story about why they're involved in your network is really great. The flip side of that is you need to tell churches your network story. I looked, in preparation for this webinar, I looked at several networks that have a presence online. Most of them don't have any messaging to churches. If I'm a church looking at that, I don't see that you want me or that you have a place for me. So you need to think about that when you think about your web presence and other kinds of ways you communicate. Brainstorm opportunities with them. How can they get engaged? And invite them individually. Again, it's great to have a web page and say, kind of, you all come, but you need to invite them. If you can get the members of your network to say, hey, go personally, individually, invite your churches to our next network meeting, or even an online webinar maybe, or some kind of a conference call, that individual invitation is really important. And again, perhaps a liaison where there's another church as a liaison to help them come in. And then first steps for churches, be proactive, look for networks. If you don't know if there's a network on an area or a passion that you have, find out from your agency, from some of your workers, ask your field partners, where do they go to get together to see the big picture and to work together. Again, brainstorm with your network what you can offer. Budget for network participation. Again, I mentioned this, it's expensive to run networks. And I would encourage that you budget for the network itself, but you also budget to attend network meetings. It's really important that consistently you send people to be a part of the network meetings. And then be a bridge for other churches. Think about how can you proactively encourage other churches to be a part of this? What would that look like? So my question at the beginning was, is it worth the effort? And I hope that I've convinced some of you to at least think about it, whether you're coming from the church side again, or from the agency or from the network side. Try it and see. Be more proactive about engaging with churches and networks together and see what God wants to do. I think you'll be encouraged by the results. Okay, I'll hand it back to Ben, who I think has some questions.
Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate everything you shared there. And I think we've got a bunch of questions from folks. I'm just looking through here the Q&A, and we've got questions from Europe, we've got questions from India, we've got questions from Africa. So where do we start? I think I'm going to start you with a question here from a brother who was wondering about, as you try to get these churches to work with a network, do you have any specific hints on how you help a network understand the uniqueness of a church? And several people have asked this.
That's a good question. And I guess the obvious first answer is ask them. Now, not every church may be equally articulate in knowing how they're unique in relationship to the network and the network's goals. But I would say talk to them about, what is their history? What is it that has brought them to your network meeting, if indeed they've come or they're interested? Are they being drawn by something they have to give or something that they want to get? Are they involved in other networks, and how have they seen contributions in other areas? And then just begin to probe. I think it's always a fun conversation from either side to say, what is your untapped potential? And at first, churches are often like, well, I don't know. And then the more they talk about it, the more excited they get. Dan and I just this morning were talking about the area, for instance, of translation. As our churches become more diverse, we're going to be amazed at the diversity of languages that we have inside of these churches. And now, if you're working in a very small an area with a specialized language, that may not be true. But for instance, with us working in the Middle East, there are lots of churches that have people that speak Arabic. There's a resource that churches don't even realize they have, but could be a uniqueness that they might bring to the table.
No, that's helpful. We had several people just want a reminder of how they can find out about networks. What do you think the best way is for them to find out about networks that are in the area that their church has an interest for ministry?
Again, if you have a worker who's in that area, ask them are there networks? Ask the agency if they're with an agency, if there's an agency connection. Eldon's Linking Global Voices webpage have somewhere over 500 networks. Now that's a little overwhelming, and you may need some help sorting out what fits for you, or where there might be a good match. But those would be the places that you could start. Vision Synergy, I think, could help many churches. I'm offering you guys now as a connection for finding. I'd be happy if you have a question to try to find a match for you. So just ask around and see what you can find out.
I think that's very helpful. Somebody mentioned to me too, there's this free newsletter called Brigada that sometimes you could put even a quick sentence in there asking for anybody who knows of a network, and sometimes you can get connected there. And often, I think there's also specific conferences sometimes to certain regions. Like I know there's a Central Asia consultation each year, and if you could perhaps have somebody attend that, I assume they would be able to meet the networks that are involved as well as other churches. Hey, we have a question here from a sister in India about the flip side, which isn't it important for the networks to let churches know that their involvement and support is needed? We had a similar question from somebody else who sort of said, how do we help the networks sort of explain how they're unique and how they can help? Any suggestions there?
I think again, sometimes one of the untapped potentials in churches is communications people, and communications people can help you see what you don't. They know what their church doesn't know better than you know what their church doesn't know, and sometimes they can tell your story for you to the church. So if you have a church connection, say, hey, is there someone who can just help us think about how to communicate that well to your audience? So again, it's using a church even to draw churches into that process.
Absolutely.
And your website, and again, I realize that sometimes because of security, you don't put too much on the website, but oftentimes you can put enough on it, at least to help churches find out to make a contact with you individually.
Yeah.
Telling stories is important from all sides.
That's a great point. And by the way, Ron had offered a similar comment. Appreciate that, Ron. That, for these networks that do have security concerns, we need to develop some of these things, connections. We have to develop them through relationships and maybe not a web presence. So I appreciate that. I'm curious about, as you think about having churches cooperate with each other, and you think about some of the denominational issues that can crop up, I'm just curious what you tend to say if you see that that's a barrier.
I think one of the things about networks is that sometimes they're a great place to be, because they don't demand that you're joining. You're not signing, a theological statement. Usually, you're coming together to discuss things, and so it's a more open environment, and you can find ways that places, levels at which you can engage, even though you've got theological differences. Or maybe you can go into that setting and find someone because they're fairly large, you can find someone of your theological stripe that you want to work with. I've seen both of those things happen. It's often helpful in a collaborative context like that to say, let's work as broadly as we can. Maybe getting outside our denominational box could be healthy, and in this particular kind of a collaboration thing. And find out, test the waters on that one to get beyond your denomination. Like I say, at the same time, someone just recently for our kinship thing said, we want to be a part of kinship, but we really want to find someone who's, shares our theological preferences. Can you match us up? And we could do that. Absolutely. By the way, we had somebody ask about the Brigada comment that I made, and we'll be sure to include some details on that in the email we send after the webinar. Ellen, we have time for a few more questions. People, if you have something you'd like to ask, don't forget we're using that Q&A button that's at the bottom or the top of your screen to submit a question. If you can't figure that out, you could put it in chat as well. I'm sure Daniel, who's watching that, can get that to me. And by the way, I'd encourage you to, in chat, just type out something that caught your attention during this last 40 minutes together. Is there a quote? Is there a concept? Because as you share something you learned with the rest of us, we learn. So I invite you to type in a chat something that caught your attention the last few minutes. If you have a question, use the Q&A. Ellen, I'm curious about churches who do get engaged with the network. You know how there's that initial excitement, but then it can wear off after a while. And I'm curious about any hints on how you keep a church engaged with a network. Yeah, I have noticed that, and I know that some of the networks have struggled. They had, like you say, they have an initial high level of enthusiasm. Everybody was really excited, and then it's like, oh, yeah, I guess it's network meeting time again, and how can we kind of wind up the excitement a little bit more? And that's a struggle from both sides. I mean, from the network side and the church side. I think we need to continue to say, how does our network meeting, since many networks do have like an annual meeting where churches come together, and it can be, sometimes I think, again, having those meetings on the field, sometimes the resourcing networks tend to always meet in the U.S. And I think that sometimes it would be great to be able to have them on the field side, because that in itself is exciting and stimulating and exposes people to some new opportunities. I think from the church side, again, as we've talked about funding and setting aside some budget money to send people to a network meeting, make sure it's not always the same person, and have a team of people who participates, because then if you lose one person or they move into another ministry or whatever, you have several people who have some continuity in that process. And make sure that you bring in younger people. I think it's a great way to engage a millennial, is to say, and I remember someone saying this to me, that they really love to go to their network meeting every year, but they realized that it was really important for other people and they only had so much money. So they said, I'm only going to go every other year. And the year I don't go, I'm going to send someone younger, fresh to it, so that we can build that commitment.
Those are all very practical hints. I'm curious, and this is off the cuff, folks. Some of these questions are just coming in, so really appreciate, Ellen, you just answering these off the top of your head. Is there a particular partnership story between a church and a network that's really encouraged you in the last 6 months? You mentioned sharing stories is powerful, and didn't know if you've heard one that was particularly well articulated or that was encouraging.
Well, we've had some really exciting ones in our kinship network, and I just have had firsthand experience with that. But we have had churches that have, again, we've just been launching. We have 2 partners in the Middle East, and Catalyst is kind of the coordinating entity here, and then we're bringing churches in from both sides. And it's just been fun to see churches here in the U.S. Come alongside and get involved. And we have one church that, again, has a gentleman who's in the process of retiring from running a business for his whole life. And to see him engaging his professional expertise, but also engaging his leadership expertise in the church. And he is now just told me again this week, I've got another church that I think is ready to join the network. So he's recruiting. And then he just this semester, at an age when most people are not tackling something like that, he said, I'm enrolled in an Arabic course. So and that's one person in a church, but he's representing others who also from that church are becoming engaged in the goal, but also engaged in the network and owning the network piece of that. And I just see him as representing so many people in churches that all that expertise is going to waste until until we can engage in it. And a network is just a great way to do that.
So with that, thank you all for attending today's webinar on Worth It, this partnership between churches and networks. And thank you again to Ellen Livingood for being with us today. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.